There are certain summers that never leave the heart, summers that unfold like a secret page in a diary, stained with sunlight and touched with the quiet fragrance of time. One such summer began for Elena on the day she returned to the small coastal town where she had spent her childhood. She had left it years ago, in pursuit of studies, work, and a life that had always seemed brighter elsewhere. Yet now, at 29, weary of the restless pace of the city, she found herself longing for something simpler, something rooted, something that reminded her that she was alive not only for success, but for meaning. The town itself had changed little. The sea still glimmered with the same ancient patience, its horizon blurred between blue and silver. The narrow streets still carried the scent of blooming linden trees and the faint salt of the tide. Houses with weathered shutters stood as if they had been waiting, as if they knew that sooner or later, those who had once belonged to them would find their way back. For Elena, stepping onto the familiar cobbled square felt like opening a memory she had almost forgotten how to read. Her grandmother's house waited at the edge of town, a modest home surrounded by a garden that had always seemed wild yet tender, overflowing with roses and lavender. It had stood empty since her grandmother's passing, yet it greeted Elena as if no time had passed. Dust lingered in the air, but beneath it, she could still feel the warmth of the woman who had raised her when her parents were too caught up in their own journeys. Cleaning the rooms, opening the windows, and letting the summer air in felt almost like reviving a heart that had fallen asleep. Each morning, Elena would wake early, pour herself tea, and walk toward the sea. She would sit on the rocks, watching the waves climb and fall, listening to their endless music. There was something healing in their rhythm, a kind of reassurance that life, no matter how fractured or uncertain, always found a way to continue. Yet in her heart, Elena carried questions she had not voiced aloud. Had she chosen the right path in leaving? Why did the life she had built in the city feel hollow now? And more than anything, why did she feel as though something or someone was missing, waiting just beyond her reach? It was during one of those walks that she first noticed him. A man standing not far from the shoreline, sketchbook in hand, his gaze fixed on the water as though it whispered secrets only he could hear. He was tall, with dark hair that caught the sunlight, and though she could not see the details of his face, there was a quiet intensity in the way he stood. Day after day, she noticed him again, always at the shore, always drawing, as if the sea itself had claimed him. At first, Elena thought little of it. Perhaps he was a visitor, perhaps an artist passing through. Yet something in the stillness of his presence unsettled her, like a chord struck deep within memory. It was not recognition, not exactly, but something close to it, a faint echo like hearing the beginning of a melody one feels they have known forever. That night, in her grandmother's home, Elena found herself restless. She stood by the open window, the air rich with the fragrance of roses, and thought of the stranger by the sea. She wondered what he was sketching, what story his hands traced on a paper. She wondered why, out of all the things she had seen since her return, it was his silhouette that lingered most vividly in her mind. And so the summer began, with questions as fragile and luminous as fireflies in the evening air. Elena could not know then that this stranger, with his silent devotion to the sea, would become the axis upon which her world would turn. She could not know that the summer she thought would heal her would also transform her in ways she had never imagined. For sometimes, love does not arrive with thunder or fanfare. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, like the soft arrival of summer light upon familiar streets, or the silent sketch of a man standing at the edge of the sea. The days settled into a rhythm as the summer deepened, and Elena felt the quiet pulse of the town weaving itself into her soul once again. Life here moved differently, not in the hurried fragments of schedules and deadlines, but in the long stretches of time shaped by tides, sunlight, and the slow unfolding of evenings. The simplicity of it was not dull, but tender. Each moment seemed to carry its own quiet significance, as though the town itself reminded her to breathe, to notice, to live. Yet beneath that calm, something stirred restlessly. The figure of the man by the sea continued to haunt her thoughts. It was not only his presence that lingered, but the unspoken aura he carried. He seemed carved out of solitude, both anchored and adrift, like someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. She wondered what drew him to the same spot each day. Was it the sea, or was it something he sought within himself? One afternoon, curious to see the sketches that had so captivated his attention, Elena chose to walk a little closer. She did not approach directly. Her steps faltered at the thought of intruding, but from a distance she caught glimpses of his work. The drawings were not simple landscapes, nor were they precise portraits. They were impressions of light and shadow, fragments of the sea captured in curves and lines, moments of the horizon frozen into pages. His hand seemed to understand the restlessness of the waves, the melancholy of the sky at dusk, the way silence could hold its own kind of music. And then she noticed something strange. Among the sketches of water and sky, there were faces. Not detailed, not fully formed, but faces half-hidden, as though emerging from memory or dream. They were delicate outlines, eyes and profiles drawn with reverence, yet left unfinished. A sense of longing emanated from them, as if he sketched not what he saw, but what he yearned for, pieces of a story untold. That evening, Elena sat in her grandmother's garden, the fading light catching the roses in hues of gold. She found herself remembering her own forgotten sketches, hidden in a box in the attic of this house. As a child, she had dreamed of becoming an artist too. She had filled countless notebooks with drawings of the sea, of streets, of faces that captured her imagination. But life had led her elsewhere, to studies that promised stability, to work that demanded her hours, to a city that never slept. Somewhere along the way, she had put her pencils away, believing dreams belonged to a younger version of herself. Now, seeing the man at the shore, she felt the echo of that lost part of her stirring awake. She wondered if this was why she had returned, not merely to rest, but to rediscover the voice she had silenced for too long. In the following days, their paths crossed more often, though never with words. At the market, she saw him carrying simple groceries, his expression distant, as though half his mind remained by the sea. On the narrow path near the cliffs, she passed him once, his sketchbook pressed under his arm, his eyes meeting hers only briefly. That single glance felt heavier than conversation, filled with something unspoken, as though both recognized in the other a mirror of solitude. And then, one morning, the unexpected happened. A storm rolled across the coast, sudden and fierce, the sky darkening with clouds that swallowed the sun. The sea raged against the rocks, and rain lashed against the windows of the old house. Elena, restless with worry, wondered if he would be there, standing by the shore, even in the storm. Against her better judgment, she wrapped herself in a shawl and ran toward the water. She found him there indeed, though not standing as usual, but crouched against the rocks, sheltering his sketchbook beneath his jacket. His hair was soaked, his clothes heavy with rain, yet his hand still moved across the page as though defying the storm itself. Something in that sight shook her, the image of a man who would not abandon his art, even when the world raged around him. Elena stood for a long moment, rain soaking through her clothes, before she turned back home. Her heart beat faster than it had in years, not from the storm, but from the realization that she was beginning to care. She had not spoken a word to him, yet already she felt her life tethering itself to his presence. That night, when the storm finally passed, Elena opened the attic and found the old box of her childhood sketches. The paper was yellowed, the drawings crude compared to what she once dreamed of, but as she turned the pages, tears filled her eyes. She was not only remembering who she had been, she was rediscovering who she still was. And in that quiet room, with the scent of rain drifting through the open window, she whispered to herself a truth she had long avoided. She was not done searching for love, not done searching for meaning, not done with the parts of herself she had buried. Somewhere between the echoes of the sea and the sketches of a stranger, Elena felt the first fragile stirrings of a new beginning. The storm had left the town washed clean, its streets glistening with puddles that mirrored the fading clouds. The sea, calmer now, moved with the slow dignity of recovery, each wave folding softly over the next. Elena felt changed too, as though the storm had passed through her as well, sweeping away a layer of dust she had not realized she carried. In its wake, everything felt sharper, the scent of wet earth, the colors of the garden, the rhythm of her own heart. The following morning, she walked again toward the sea, uncertain if the man would return after such a night. Yet there he was, standing as though nothing had broken the continuity of his ritual. His clothes were dry, his sketchbook balanced steadily in his hands, his gaze fixed once again upon the horizon. For the first time, Elena allowed herself to approach closer, her steps slow, hesitant but steady. She stopped a few paces away, her breath caught between fear of intrusion and the pull of curiosity. He lifted his head, sensing her presence, and for the first time, she saw his face fully. His features were not striking in the way one might expect, not flawless, not sharp like a portrait, but they held a quiet gravity that drew her in. His eyes, deep and unguarded, carried both weariness and wonder, as though they had watched too much and yet still longed for more. There was no exchange of words. Instead, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition not of acquaintance, but of something older, something elemental. He closed his sketchbook, not out of secrecy, but as though to give her space, to let her presence exist beside his without boundary. Together, they stood in silence, the sea speaking for them both. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, without arrangement, their paths began to align. She would find him by the shore in the early morning, and she would sit nearby, sometimes bringing her own sketchbook, newly reclaimed from the attic. At first her lines were clumsy, her hand uncertain after years of neglect, but the act itself felt like a return. She did not try to match him. His pages were alive with depth and shadows she could not yet reach, but she felt no shame in the simplicity of her own drawings. It was enough to create again, to allow her hand to follow the quiet pulse of her heart. Sometimes they crossed paths beyond the shore. At the bakery, where the air was sweet with fresh bread, he stood before her in line and quietly stepped aside so she could pass. At the small library, she noticed him browsing shelves of poetry, his fingers pausing over worn spines. She never spoke, yet each encounter stitched them closer, like threads weaving a fabric neither had planned but both began to recognize. And then, one evening, as the sun set in flames of crimson and gold, she found herself walking toward the cliffs. The sea stretched vast below, the horizon endless, and the air was heavy with salt and the scent of wild thyme. He was there, sitting with his back against the stone, sketchbook open upon his knees. This time, however, the drawing was not of the sea. It was of her, her own face, captured in delicate strokes, half-turned as though caught in thought, her hair drifting in the breeze, her eyes not fixed on the world but inward, toward some quiet dream. The sight took her breath away. She stood frozen, heart thundering, until he noticed her shadow across his page. He looked up, and though he did not speak, she felt the truth in his gaze. She had already entered his world, as deeply as he had entered hers. That night, Elena could not sleep. She lay awake in her grandmother's bed, listening to the hush of the sea outside, her mind replaying the image of herself on his page. It was not vanity that stirred her, but the realization that he had seen her more clearly than she had allowed herself to be seen in years. He had drawn not the face she presented to the world, but the one she had hidden, the one still yearning, still vulnerable, still capable of love. It frightened her, this unveiling, yet it also filled her with a fragile joy. For the first time in a long while, she felt she was not invisible, not lost in the noise of the city or the silence of her own doubts. She was seen, she was known, and though no word had yet passed between them, Elena knew with a certainty that defied logic. The summer had brought her not only home, but towards something she had never truly dared to believe in. The first threads of love had been woven, delicate, tentative, but unbreakable. The hush between them had stretched for so long that it had become its own kind of language. Silence was no longer emptiness, but presence, a soft thread binding them without demand. Yet there comes a moment when silence begins to ache, when the heart longs for the shape of words, for confirmation that what is felt is not only imagined but shared. That moment arrived on a morning heavy with mist, when the sea lay veiled in silver and the town seemed suspended between dream and waking. Elena walked toward the shore, sketchbook under her arm, and found him seated on the rocks as always, his posture steady, his hand tracing lines with patience. She sat nearby, her breath visible in the cool air, and for a long while they worked side by side, two solitary souls mirroring one another. And then, unexpectedly, he spoke. His voice was quiet, as though unsure of its right to disturb the air. He asked if she had always drawn, his tone more like a thought spoken aloud than a question directed at her. For a heartbeat, Elena froze. It was the first sound of him beyond the rhythm of his presence. She answered softly, her own voice trembling with the weight of the moment. She told him of the attic, the forgotten sketches, the childhood dream she had buried under years of responsibility. He listened, and though he said little, his eyes carried a depth that told her words mattered. When he spoke again, it was to admit that he had not drawn for others in a long time. He sketched the sea because it was endless, because it never judged, because it allowed him to pour into it all that he could not share elsewhere. His confession lingered between them, tender and raw, like a window opened into a hidden room. Elena found herself wanting to know more, who he was, where he came from, what story lay behind the solitude etched into his every gesture. He told her his name, Adrian. It sounded both unfamiliar and strangely inevitable, as though it had been waiting for her to hear it. As days unfolded, words began to weave into their shared silence. They spoke of art, of books, of small memories that rose like shells from the sand. He told her of his travels, of places where he had sketched mountains, rivers, cities that glittered but never felt like home. She told him of the city she had left behind, of the work that had consumed her, of the emptiness that had driven her back to the town of her childhood. Their conversations were not grand revelations, but fragments, pieces of themselves offered slowly, carefully, like fragile gifts. Yet in those fragments, intimacy bloomed. With every word, they shed layers of solitude, uncovering something rare, the recognition that neither had to pretend. One evening, as twilight brushed the sky in shades of violet, they lingered longer than usual by the cliffs. The sea stretched below them, vast and forgiving, and the air smelled of salt and lavender carried from the gardens inland. Adrian turned to her then, his voice low, and admitted that he had drawn her before he truly knew her, because he had seen something in her presence that stirred him, a quiet resilience, a longing unspoken. He said he had been afraid to show her, afraid it would break the fragile balance between them. Elena's heart ached with both wonder and fear. She told him she had seen herself in his drawings, not as she thought she was, but as she had once hoped to be. She admitted that it had frightened her too, to be seen so clearly. Yet in that moment, fear softened into gratitude, for there was a strange liberation in being known without disguise. The world around them seemed to pause, as though listening. In the stillness, Elena realized that she had not only returned to the town to rediscover herself. She had been led here, to him, to this unlikely crossing of paths. She could not yet name it love, for love was a word too vast to be spoken so soon. But she felt the beginnings of something undeniable, something that tethered her not only to the sea and her past, but to a future she had not dared imagine. The mist returned that night, cloaking the town in softness, but Elena's heart was brighter than it had been in years. Words had finally broken the silence, and with them came the promise of more, a story unfolding not only in sketches, but in the fragile, luminous space between two souls who had at last begun to find one another. The summer had ripened into its fullest bloom. Days spilled golden across the town, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and salt, Evenings softened into skies brushed with violet and silver. For Elena, each dawn felt like a gift, a chance to meet Adrian by the sea, to walk with him along the narrow streets, to sit together in the quiet garden of her grandmother's house. What had begun in silence had grown into companionship, and companionship into something richer, more luminous. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through the tenderness of small moments. The way he placed a wild rose between the pages of her sketchbook without a word. The way she left fresh bread by his doorstep when she knew he had spent long hours sketching, forgetting to eat. The way they shared books, leaving notes for one another in the margins, messages more intimate than spoken words. Love did not burst upon them like a storm. It unfolded gently, like the tide, steady, inevitable, impossible to resist. And yet, beneath that serenity, shadows stirred. Elena first sensed it in his eyes, when she caught him staring at the horizon longer than usual, his sketchbook closed upon his lap. His gaze seemed to stretch beyond the sea, toward something far away, untouchable. At first, she thought it was only the melancholy of an artist, the longing that always haunted those who carried more within than they could express. But as the days passed, she noticed a weight in him, an unspoken distance that no words could bridge. It was during one of their walks by the cliffs that the truth began to surface. Adrian confessed, in fragments, that he had never meant to stay in the town. He had arrived only to escape, to find solace by the sea after months of drifting without anchor. His life elsewhere was uncertain, work unfinished, commitments half-abandoned, relationships left unresolved. He had thought himself incapable of belonging anywhere, incapable of building what others called home. Elena listened, her heart tightening with every word. She wanted to tell him that here, now, he had found belonging with her in this town, in the shared silence and the fragile beginnings of love. But she also understood the restlessness in his voice. It was not simple, this ache that pulled him toward the horizon. It was the wound of someone who had always moved, always searched, never truly found a place to stay. That night, Elena lay awake in her grandmother's house, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Fear pressed against her ribs. She had only just rediscovered herself, only just begun to believe in the possibility of love again. Was she destined to lose it before it could fully bloom? Was Adrian only passing through, like the storms and seasons, leaving behind sketches and memories, but no promise of tomorrow? The days that followed were bittersweet. Their closeness remained. They still drew together, still walked the shore, still shared the quiet music of presence. But beneath every moment lingered the unspoken question, how long before he would leave? One evening, she found him sitting on the rocks, his sketchbook open to a page she had never seen. It was filled with drawings of her, not one, not two, but many, her face in different lights, different moods, different silences. The sight both moved and wounded her. For why would he draw her so endlessly if he did not intend to keep her in his life? Or perhaps this was his way of holding what he could not stay to keep. Adrian noticed her gaze and closed the book gently, as though ashamed. He looked at her then, his expression torn, and whispered that he feared to love her because he did not trust himself to remain. Elena's heart broke at his words, not because she doubted his feelings, but because she knew they were true. Love had found them, fragile and bright, but the question remained whether love alone could anchor a drifting soul. The sea roared that night, waves crashing harder against the rocks, as though mirroring the storm within them both. Elena stood by her window, watching the restless tide, and realized she was at the edge of choice. To open herself fully to love meant risking the ache of loss. To hold back meant denying the very thing she had longed for. And so the summer's light, once so gentle, now carried a shadow that whispered of endings even as love sought to begin. The shadow that had crept into Elena's days lingered, delicate yet heavy, like mist refusing to lift from the sea. Each time she and Adrian met, their closeness remained, but beneath it stirred the ache of uncertainty. His gaze often wandered toward the horizon, as though searching for an answer the waves might carry to him. And Elena, though she longed to ask him to stay, felt that love was not a chain to bind, but a freedom to choose. It was near the end of summer when the truth could no longer remain unspoken. They walked together along the cliffs, the air warm but touched with a faint breath of autumn. The sea below glittered with restless light, endless and untamed. Adrian stopped, closing his sketchbook, and told her softly that he could not remain in the town. The words did not surprise her, yet they struck like wind against fragile glass. He spoke with honesty, his voice trembling. He had drifted too long, left too many paths unfinished. He needed to face what he had abandoned, to mend what he had broken in himself. Staying now, even for her, would mean building upon unfinished ground. Elena's heart ached, but she understood. Love, she realized, was not only about holding, but about allowing. And so she did not plead, did not ask him to remain against his own truth. Instead, she told him that he had given her something precious, the return of her own forgotten self, the rediscovery of her art, the reminder that her heart was still alive. She told him she loved him not because he filled her emptiness, but because he had reminded her she was never truly empty at all. He looked at her then with eyes both sorrowful and luminous, and said he had found in her what he had never found elsewhere, not merely beauty, but home. And though he had to leave, he promised he would return, not as a wanderer, but as a man ready to stay. The days that followed were marked with quiet goodbyes. They did not cling, did not drown in despair, but cherished every moment as though storing them for the future. On the morning of his departure, Elena stood by the shore as the boat carried him away, his silhouette framed against the rising sun. She did not weep. Instead, she held her sketchbook close, her fingers stained with charcoal, her heart steady with hope. Autumn arrived, then winter, the town cloaked in winds and silence. Yet Elena did not feel alone. She filled her days with drawing, rediscovering her gift with newfound devotion. She opened her grandmother's home to light and laughter, turning it into a place where neighbors gathered, where art and stories flowed. And always, she carried within her the certainty that love, once found, does not vanish with distance. It lingers, it waits, it grows in the quiet soil of trust. When spring returned, bringing with it the fragrance of blossoms and the restless music of the sea, Elena stood once more upon the shore. And there, among the waves and light, she saw him, Adrian, sketchbook in hand, walking toward her with the calm resolve of a man who had chosen, at last, to belong. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The tide that had once threatened to pull them apart had now carried them back together. And as they embraced beneath the vast sky, Elena felt the truth settle deep within her. Love is not about holding forever, but about trusting in the return, about believing in what the heart already knows. The summer that had begun with silence ended with promise. A promise not of perfection, but of presence. Not of certainty, but of devotion. A promise that, even after storms and distances, love would always find its way home. And so their story did not end, but began anew, with hope, with courage, with the gentle, unshakable light of love.